Hey everyone. So today's topic is basically the things that we use from the environment. And out of everything that we use from the environment, there are two categories for those things. And the reason I say things is because it's not always a physical thing. It can also be a non-physical process that we're using from the environment. All right, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. So, those two things that we use from the or the two categories of things we use from the environment, we call those natural resources and natural services. So, resources and services. Most people have heard of resources, and most people know of some natural resources that humans use. Those are pretty easy to think of. So, resources are any physical thing that we take from the environment, from nature. That's why it's called a natural resource. Anything that we take from nature and we use for basically for our benefit. All right, it's not always something that we need to survive. It's something that we use for entertainment. All right, so natural resources are physical things. All right, so water, all right, the air that we breathe. All right, those are natural resources. All right, we're gonna put water down as our example. All right, water is a natural resource, and it's a natural resource that we use quite a bit of. All right, over here, an example of a natural service that we use. So, one of the big things, if you traveled throughout Texas, if you've driven through, especially West Texas, one of the things that you start to see more often are the wind turbines. All right, and we're going to talk about wind turbines later on in the year, but wind turbines take a natural service, and we use that service in order to produce energy. All right, and so here, that natural service that of course I'm talking about is the wind. All right, so the wind is not a physical thing. All right, you can't take wind and put it into a box and give it as a present. All right, wind is a service. It is a process. It is a thing, a system that occurs in nature. All right, and so we use that process. We use the wind to spin the turbine, that wind turbine, which in turn spins a little a generator inside of the turbine, and that generator produces electricity. Right. So essentially, we are taking what nature is producing, a service that nature is producing, and we're turning it into something that we can use. All right, and that's electricity. So we're using a natural service to produce something that we use. All right. Now, as far as natural services, at this point, that's all that you need to know about natural services. Is there are processes in nature that we use for our benefit. So let's look at resources, natural resources. All right, because natural services, for the most part, it's not the amount of that service is not going to change. When we're talking about physical things, the amount or the availability of those resources does change. And that's why we want to focus on the resources and not necessarily the services. So we're going to look at the example of water. Okay, water is a natural resource, and there's a lot of water here on Earth. As we'll learn later on, out of all that water, water covers 2/3 of the Earth's surface. All right, and the Earth's pretty big, so there's a lot of water. But, and I'm sorry, I almost forgot. There's a lot of water in the atmosphere too. You take a breath in, you're breathing in a small amount of water vapor. So there's water in the oceans, there's water in the atmosphere, there's water in the streams, the lakes, the ponds. There's water in you. Right? But as I was saying, what we'll talk about later is not all of that water is available for us to use. We can't drink the water in the ocean. It's too salty. The salinity is too high. We can't drink a glacier. You can't drink the water from somebody's body. You can't drink the water from the atmosphere. All right? So the amount of water as a resource is limited. Now, there are two types of resources. Or when we look at a resource, we'll look at it as either renewable or non-renewable. Now, a renewable resource is one that as we use up that resource, nature replaces it. And so if we were to graph this out, so here's time. Time is on the x-axis, and the amount of water is here on the y-axis. Let's use, we're going to use red as human use. We're going to use blue as what nature replaces. So the water cycle is what replaces water back into streams and lakes and ponds, because that's the reservoir that we get our water from. When we're using water, we get it from streams, lakes, ponds, springs, things like that. All right. So the freshwater sources, the water cycle replaces water that's taken out of those reservoirs. All right. Those freshwater sources. So let's say the water cycle, because the water cycle is it's pretty steady, with the exception of years when we have serious droughts. All right, then yes, the water cycle will replace less water, and we'll talk about what happens when that occurs. But for the most part, the water cycle is pretty consistent, and so the replacement of water is pretty steady. Now, if humans, remember red is human use, humans are using that water, and let's say water use increases and levels off, and it doesn't reach the amount of water that the water cycle is replacing, then we still have water that's left. Right? We're not using up all of the water. We call this a renewable resource, because water, in this case, not always, in this case, the water is being replaced at a rate that is higher than the rate that humans are using. So, here, humans are using the water, but it doesn't reach the amount of water, the total amount of water, that the water cycle is putting back in. All right, that is a renewable resource. The other type is our non-renewable. We have our graph here. And so let's say we do have a year where there are droughts. And so we have the water cycle doing its thing here. And then all of a sudden we have a drought. And the water cycle is replacing less water into the streams and ponds and lakes and springs and all that stuff. And so there's less water for us to use. If we're still using the same amount of water, what happens here? So water use increases, and all of a sudden we've crossed that line where the water cycle is replacing the water. And so now there's not enough water for us to use. We can't continue to use it at this rate because there is no water to use. So what happens is we're kind of forced to use less water. The amount of water that we're taking out of nature, we're taking it at a higher rate than the water cycle can replace it. And so there's not enough water for us to use. We can't use it anymore. And so that now causes water to become a non-renewable resource. So those are the types of resources. When we classify a resource, we say it's either renewable or non-renewable. And the difference is nature replacing that resource at a faster rate than we're using? If the answer to that question is yes, it's renewable. And we have the ability to use that for a long period of time. If the answer to the question is no, if we're using it at a higher rate than nature can replace it, then it's a non-renewable resource. Even before we cross that line, it's a non-renewable resource. And so we're hurting the environment by using those non-renewable resources. That's all I have for you today. So if you need any help, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Have a great day.